the African Union was being established, you had these progressive leaders, the Kagames, the African Union, the former president of Algeria, Bouteflika, and the president of South Africa, Mbeki, they made sure that the Constitutive Act of the African Union has provisions for interventions in cases of things like genocide. And now they have another test, integrate, and they're not doing anything. Because at the end of the day, it is themselves who have to come down and discuss and then decide. So one thing, Dr. Award, that for me I see as a gap is the solidarity of people. We have left this thing on the hands of the states, that the states are the ones who can be able to discuss about the international issues and not the people. Our foreign affairs are more capable with all the facilities to handle international issues from a different country and not the people. Assume in every capital in Africa, in Nairobi, in Libreville, in Kampala, in every corner of Africa, people had gathered to demonstrate and demand their countries to implement the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which demands the African Union to protect Africans. I am very sure that some countries' pressure would really help. But we missed that. And that's the problem that I see. The solutions, African problems, African solutions for African problems, I think it must have the people. And this is what is missing. And I think this is why we don't see much solidarity. What is going on in Ethiopia, in Tigray region, we're leaving it to the Tigrayans, and other people don't see that they are concerned about it, as they saw what happened in Rwanda. So we have very good examples on how Africa itself has failed to solve its own problems until the foreign forces intervened and tried to help.
If I can make a quick point, I think
I'm sorry, I was muted. Come in. Go ahead.
Yeah, yes, no, I was saying that I think my colleague Zito has made a very eloquent, I think, point, which is that Africa cannot advance unless, we begin to see fundamental changes. I think one of the ironies is the fact that actually the African Union has been reforming very rapidly in recent years. But all these reforms have been largely, first of all, they have not been quite effective. But secondly, they have been actually about institutions and not about the African Union itself as a moral voice of the African people. If you ask African states, what is the ethical African policy, nobody will be able to tell you. And that, I think, is the tragedy we face. Back to you, Doctor.
No, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, one of the very disturbing arguments that I have seen recently is people making the argument that the African Union, over the course of the last 10 years, has gone through a very significant normative and institutional reform. And the West, by intervening and demanding certain things, it is undermining the ability of the Union to do things on its own. I think, when you say that in isolation from a particular context, that might make sense, but that argument was being made in the light of the atrocities in Tigray. And there are these very cynical deployments, and the more institutions reform themselves, sometimes the more they remain the same. Mada, I want to come to you because we want to zoom in specifically on the election issues. Ethiopia's twice postponed election was conducted on the 21st of June. The international community, largely Ethiopians, saw that election as a sham election, not credible, wasn't free. It was being held at a time where you have significant issues, security-wise, political crisis throughout the country. Talk to us about the setting for this election and why this election is problematic in terms of the challenges, the political challenges Ethiopia is facing, the security challenges that Ethiopia is facing.
Yeah, as you say, this election, much awaited election, was carried out on a few days ago at the backdrop of a genocidal war in Tigray and so many political crises happening all across, the southern nation and nationalities, particularly in Benishangul and other parts of the country, also in Oromia as well. And the whole idea of this election, in my opinion, was not really to provide people with the constitutional right to elect their legitimate government. It was rather a failed attempt to gain legitimacy in order to continue to be on power unconstitutionally from the Abiy Ahmed regime. However, this election, I don't even think that it would, achieve the desired goal that was in mind by those who advocated for the election to happen a few days ago. Because first of all, as you all know, election is about giving people an alternative options of policies that they think are good for them. But in this particular setting, there were a group of political parties. All of them have different names, but the political ideology that they have with regards to Ethiopian state building is the same. All of these political parties, advocate for a centralized, strong governance whereby the different nation and nationalists in Ethiopia would not have, the very fundamental right to self-administration. I say this because, as you might be aware of, all of the opposition political parties didn't really participate in this election. Those that could have posed a very meaningful challenge to this, those advocates of the central government didn't participate. Some of them because they're languishing in prison illegally, some of them because they're fighting a genocidal war against invading forces, and others have protested the election due to different, reasons, mainly because some of their prominent political leaders are unjustly imprisoned. So for me, it felt like this was a ceremony whereby a self-proclaimed king got the coronation ceremony. Other than that, I don't think it actually have achieved any kind of meaningful step that would actually solve the political and security crisis that Ethiopia is going through right now. At the same time, as you rightfully highlighted at the beginning, for the most part, the international community didn't really support this election because the European Union, the US government didn't really send their observers, although they cited different reasons that may not necessarily address the genocidal war in Tigray and the political and security crisis in other parts of Ethiopia. However, overall, there were no any credible observers to actually see how the process was conducted. So for me, the election was far from a free and fair election. It was rather an orchestrated drama by the Prosperity Party to cement legitimacy so that they can remain in power unconstitutionally, undemocratically, and prolong the ongoing crisis that the country is in. So most of the time we push for elections to carry out, hoping that they will facilitate the democratization process of a country. However, in this regard, this election is set to do quite the contrary, because now you have a group of so-called politicians in Addis who are going to claim that they have a constitutional mandate to govern the country. So they're going to use this to even intensify their offensive on political parties that do not see eye to eye with them in terms of ideology, but at the same time, they're going to use this to crush dissent and different political openings from journalists or activists and opposition parties as well. So I feel like this is their tech by having this election, the Prosperity Party and Abiy Ahmed took the process of disintegrating Ethiopia even one step further. So it's very much worrying, and we will see how it unfolds. But in my opinion, I think this is only going to exacerbate the process of disintegrating Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mother, for that. Rashid, I want to come to you. You are one of the most astute observers of the Horn of Africa region, and I really enjoy your analysis. And I wanted to ask you the kind of broader regional implications of this. Elections were postponed not just in Ethiopia, but also in Somalia. And there are some transits in terms of relations, for example, that are being built. And I don't know, maybe things are changing over the last 2-3 months, but initially we have this tripartite arrangement between Isaias, Abiy Ahmed, and Farmajo. And it seems as if the advice to postpone the election and centralize power comes from a very particular place. Can you situate for us what the implications of this election-related debate is for the Horn of Africa and also for the people of these two countries?
Thank you very much, Dr. Awol. And I also want to thank Niaza for that excellent, I think, analysis of the elections in Ethiopia, which I basically share. There's no doubt that the elections in Ethiopia, I think, mark not a consolidation of democracy, but actually a reversal of democratic gains in Ethiopia. Broadly, I think what interests me is what Abiy will do with that victory. There are two ways of looking at it. One, of course, is that Abiy will basically declare that he's won overwhelmingly. There is no opposition in the country, and consolidate power, and then probably begin to do some interesting things with that power, which is to basically reconfigure his support base, to slightly move his politics away from the right and towards from the center, rebuild his Oromo, support structures, and then broaden his politics and begin to reach out to Tigray and the conflict. That is a very optimistic scenario, and it is my hope and prayer that this is what will happen after the elections. But I think anybody who has analyzed Abiy as a person and as a leader and looks at the dynamics will not be that optimistic. I think the most likely scenario would be Abiy consolidating power, but also becoming even more hardline in his policies. And the rhetoric is already very clear. During the elections, when he was voting, putting in the ballot paper, he basically denied the hunger in Tigray and said there's no famine in Tigray. There are no people dying. This is a small problem and we can fix it. So this, I think, is a big problem. But just coming back to your broader question, there is no doubt that there is a big reversal of democracy in the region. Elections have not just been delayed in Ethiopia, but they have also been delayed in Somalia by almost now 6 months. The president has also dug in his heels and unless an election in which he hands over power, he's not going to leave Villa Somalia. So the electoral politics have become very combustible in the Horn. This is not to say anything new. It's just to say that electoral politics, in which, first of all, the elites are fractured, there's no elite compact, there's deep division. Elections do not help countries transition to stability. They are only one instrument. And so I think this is one of the arguments that is being made, that it would have been better for Abiy to have actually resolved at least or minimized some of the crises which Ethiopia faces before he heads into an election. On the issue of the trilateral alliance, I think this was largely a compact between three individuals and not necessarily three nations. I think it was largely about regime survival and not necessarily to advance specific goals. I also think that the senior partner in this relationship was obviously Afewerki, and Afewerki exerted a very malign peer influence over these other two individuals. You have to remember that Eritrea and Afewerki are essentially the outliers in a region which is beginning to move into some kind of a democratic path. This is the only state which has basically put a stop very early on to the democratic experiment. In my view, democracy has become was fundamentally aborted. It is still born in Eritrea. And so when Abiy began to reach out to Afewerki, I think part of the conversation was Afewerki basically saying that, look, if you want to fix politics internally, you have to, be more tough and take on the opposition. Ironically, recently, about I think a year ago, there was a speech given by Farmajo. This speech by Farmajo is almost the same script which was read by Afewerki many years ago, in which he basically gave a very interesting hypothesis of why fragile post-conflict states must not play with electoral politics. His theory is that you need fundamentally 20 years before you begin to move towards liberal democracy. And the argument is very compelling. States are fragile, institutions need to be built up, politics is fractured and fragmented, so you need a strong, powerful leader to assert control, and then afterwards, will you begin to see changes. And this is the same powerful argument which have been used by other authoritarian states all across the region. And so I think there is a tendency to use elections as basically fig leaf to cement credibility, but also to completely circumvent the electoral process completely. But just to summarize, I think there is no doubt that democracy is in serious crisis in the home. Abiy and Afewerki asserts a big malign influence of other states. His relationship now with Abiy and his involvement, I think, in the war in Tigray raise very disturbing fundamental questions about the prospect for stability in the home. Back to you, Doctor.
Thank you for that really nuanced points, Rashid. When I think of the Farmajo context and Farmajo taking lessons from Abiy and Isaias in the context of Somalia, it's a society that is markedly different from Ethiopia and Eritrea. You will see that there is an even relationship there in terms of who gives advice and who is expected to take advice. Isaias, of course, has done absolutely nothing in Eritrea for the last 30 years, other than building what you could describe as a national security state. Only elites that Eritrea produced over 30 years. So the influence that Isaias is exerting on nations in that region right now is extremely concerning. I think that is one of the most significant traits for aspirations to build a more democratic future. In terms of Ethiopia and the kind of more optimistic scenario that you depicted, I wish that is the direction Abiy Ahmed would go. But if you look at what Abiy has done over the course of the last 3 years, and as you said, somebody who governed, well, not governed really, ruled the country as if he had an overwhelming mandate from the public. Remember, he came to a mandate that he inherited from Abiy Ahmed. That mandate was contested. He himself denounced that mandate. And that mandate, indeed, he extended that mandate. Nevertheless, Abiy never thought that there is any limit on his power. And anyone who has a very basic understanding of states, society relations, constitutionalism, would have really somewhat, had second thought about the standards and norms that are applicable to leaders that are not elected and do not have mandate from public. So I think it's really hard to imagine how Abiy, after securing this mandate, which is going to be overwhelming because nobody ran against him, it's difficult to imagine how he is going to be that leader that will show some magnanimity and face the serious challenges this country is facing and deal with these stakeholders that he has declared terrorists in some cases, locked up behind bars in other cases. It's very difficult to see how that happens. And of course, if he doesn't do that and continues with the way he was governing Ethiopia, and I think what Ma'aza signaled is probably the most likely outcome in Ethiopia. Karim, I wanna come to you. Let's talk Uganda and the recent election. Whenever elections happen, there are also moments for debate, moments for reflection about the country's progress in terms of democratization. During the election, there has been a lot of debates. So the fact that the president has been in office for such a long period of time, that the human rights conditions in the country were bad, and oppositions are facing significant repression. But after the election is held and concluded, then things disappear from the international public space. What is the situation like right now in Uganda post the recent election?
I think just the same as what's going on in Tigray is what happened in Uganda. We had the electoral process, which was really, really mad with violence. We had a presidential candidate who was campaigning wearing a black jacket, whose campaign team was raided the island and put in prison a few weeks before the election. And nobody said anything about it. And after the elections, I remember the State Department didn't recognize it. The African Union didn't say anything about it. Even as we speak right now, more young people are being raided in the middle of the night, and they are being tortured, mutilated. Some of them are still missing since November. Those who are arrested in November haven't yet, been to court. Thousands of young people are still relinquishing in detention centers. So to move away from that is the lack of, support from our international partners, especially the US. With the US, we have worked side by side with the US since 2003. We went to Afghanistan, Iraq, we in Somalia. And Somalia has been one of the major foreign policy issues for the region. And Museveni has played it really, really cool with Somalia because it's a way of hiding gross human rights abuses, because everybody's going to hail him as someone who's doing a great job in Somalia while mistreating the people in Uganda. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Comrade Rashid for debunking the 189 Al-Shabaab militants that the government of Uganda had propagated having been killed in November. So until you helped us push and hold them accountable, to ask them where the numbers, who are these people, where was they, Uganda was going to get away with it. And that has been happening since 2016. Every time Museveni would be killing people in Uganda, he'd rush up to cleanse himself in Somalia. I'll give a few examples. In 2016, almost 150 people were killed in a small in Kasese by Museveni's military. And what he did, the army generals that were responsible for that raid were sent to Somalia. They were never held responsible after that. The same thing happened in November during the election campaign in 2020. After killing more than 100 people on November 18th, he had said he brought some soldiers from Somalia to come and, calm the situation down. After killing people, he went to Somalia and said, you know what, we have killed 189 Al-Shabaab militants. So that he covers that. So I'm grateful for the work. And if we are to talk about African problems and African solutions, I think this is one of the ways we are, it is being evident. We are creating synergies. We are having people speak out on problems from other places. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Ethiopia is another country where this idea that this is, a significant, strategically important country in the Horn of Africa, participating in global peacekeeping operations, responsible for maintaining peace and security in the Horn of Africa, and this is in most cases used as a justification to legitimize an authoritarian system. That has been one of the most important, I think, powerful tools these regimes have used. Let me come to you, Zito. Tanzania, until very recently, has been one of the most, hopeful examples in Africa, and things changed recently. What happened, and where are we now?
Yeah, we have lost that status since 2016, after Magufuli came to power. Before that, Tanzania was the area was the country in which other countries would come for consultation regarding various issues happening. Arusha was a Geneva of Africa, where all the peace negotiations were conducted, negotiations on peace in DRC, peace in Burundi, peace in Rwanda, peace in South Sudan recently, also was being held in Arusha. But since 2016, after we had a president who was inward looking, his concentration was more internal, and the work of the East African community slowed down. Actually, there was a time the heads of states never met for 2 years. There was no summit for 2 years. And Tanzania, I cannot say confidently that it became a pariah, but it was heading towards that. As far as if people compare the role that Tanzania played in 70s, in 80s, in early 90s on the liberation, and how the President Magufuli was holding the country. And in 2020, last year, we had what I always call a mis-election. There was no election really that took place in Tanzania. It was a military operation in Zanzibar, the semi-autonomous part of the country, one of the countries that joined with Tanganyika to form the United Republic of Tanzania. And in the mainland Tanzania, it was a security operation. There was no voting. I myself contested in the election in 2020, and I had more votes than my opponent, who was from CCM, but the ruling party candidate was declared a winner. And it happened so all over the country, to the extent that the parliament has, out of all constituencies in the mainland, 214 constituencies, only 2 constituencies were given to the opposition or parties, and all leaders of the parties were rigged out. So that's how it was, and Tanzania lost its voice. But now Tanzania is coming back. After March this year, we had our president died in office, and the vice president took over in a very smooth transition. and she has already visited two important countries in the region, Uganda and Kenya, and restored the role Tanzania has been playing in the international, in the East African community. And the summit had taken place. The East African Community Summit took place last month, if I'm not mistaken. And things are moving very fast. And now there is a process of bringing in DRC into the East African community. Very fast, the regional integration is going back. However, our voice at the international level, especially the African Union, is still muted. Of course, Tanzania will never raise the voice as far as elections are concerned, because the last elections were hugely rigged. And many of us were arrested and later being released by the police for protesting against the election. And some of the opposition leaders even went in exile. We have a number of the opposition leaders who are living in exile because of what happened in the previous election. So now we are trying to bring back the country, and the president is trying to make sure that the Tanzania of pre-2015 is back, but it is not easy. And we have a very good foreign minister who is internationally recognized figure, but we want Tanzania that can stand up and speak for against injustices. And this is Tanzania. Under normal circumstances, for example, today, Tanzanian position on what is going on in Tigray would have been open because Tanzania stood against all injustices. And analysts like Abdi might remember, even at the time, at the height of liberation in 1968, when some sort of genocide was happening in Biafra against the Igbos, Tanzania was among the first country to recognize Biafra as an independent republic. And the reasons that President Nyerere then gave was very simple: that you cannot bomb people into submission. You cannot kill people and make them say that, yeah, you are Nigerians then. So I really think that Tanzania wouldn't be quiet if we really go back to the foreign policy that we had against injustices in the world. I hope we'll be able to do. Yeah.
You make a very powerful point. You cannot bomb people into submission. And I think what histories of resistance show is that it doesn't matter how much you repress people, how much you massacre people, those violent responses would only strengthen the resolve of people to resist even more. And one of the things that stuns me the most about events and tragedies in Ethiopia over the course of the last maybe 1 year is the fact that we have been in this space before. 1970s, late 1970s, Ethiopia is precisely in this kind of space, both in terms of the level of violence and repression that is used by the government, but also in terms of the ideological vision that people have for their future. And we are doing exactly the same things. I want us to talk about international actors. We talked about African government, we talked about people, we talked about the current election. Let's focus on international actors, because while international actors could not determine the democratic future, that is very important players. They are a critical source of political support, economic support, military support, a range of different kinds of influences that they can exert to enable things one way or another, depending on where they stand. At one level, there is this discourse that, well, we shouldn't really expect the West to address our problems because they have really never intervened on behalf of people. It's all about national interest, about power, and so on and so forth. And I think historically, we have seen that countries acted based on what is consistent with their national interest. But at the same time, you face these very grim situations where civilian populations are subjected to a brutal regime that is determined to impose its will by any means necessary. And my question is, you can relate it to a specific example when you respond to this. To what extent do we as Africans rely on the West in terms of seeking support for the challenges that we face? Let me start from Zito instead of going the same direction. Let me do it backwards again. Zito.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, yes, to what extent Africa relies on the West is to a very large extent. To a very large extent because there are a lot of interest in Africa, whether historical. There are countries that just intervene in African affairs because of the historical relationship among those countries. For example, colonialism. You see the way the French are intervening in every single issue in West Africa, French-speaking countries. You see the way Belgium is heavily involved into the Congo, DRC, Rwanda. Now Rwanda, it has been just gone a bit down after Rwanda joined the Commonwealth, but Burundi as well. So there are interests and also commercial interests, because there are investments of these countries into the continent. So also because of the vacuum that exists because of the continental mechanism lacking in solving the problems that we are having. So with that, and nature abhors vacuum. With that, the West moves on. But these days, we cannot discuss about the foreign intervention and we just mean the West. You have China as a global power, but mostly Chinese interventions is on the side of the ruling class all the time. I haven't seen an intervention where China makes in support of the people of a particular country. And so for that matter, many African countries now are re-establishing, resetting their international relationship with China because China doesn't ask questions. So it's not just enough to analyze the West and to what extent the West intervenes into African issues, which is very, very large. But at least sometimes when the West intervenes, there are issues of human rights, of democracy, that the West can speak out. US can speak out, UK can speak out, Canada can speak out. But it also depends on the relationship between those countries involved. There are times you see the West even supporting dictatorial regimes, autocratic regimes, just because of their interests. But for me, I think, in conclusion, the vacuum that is created by the African institutions, by the Africans in dealing with the problems that are happening in Africa, give a chance for the foreign countries to intervene, and they intervene for their interests and not necessarily for the interests of the Africans themselves. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Rashid, I want to come to you. We've been talking so far about tragic situations, the dashed hopes Africans had for democracy, for a society that is fairer, more equal, more substantively just, and so on and so forth. And there is one success story on the continent that we don't often talk about, and that is Somaliland. This is an entity that is not yet recognized as a sovereign state. But nevertheless, in terms of democratization, in terms of infrastructure, this is a country that has done really, really well. What is the secret? And also, can you link that to why, for example, Somaliland has not been recognized, despite the fact that it has been doing extremely well for a long period of time?
Thank you very much, Dr. Awal, and I think it is quite good that you raised this, because it has been the biggest story also this week with the opening of the port of Berbera, which is a very impressive project funded by the United Arab Emirates, but still, I think promising some future economic integration in the region, much more interesting than probably the idea of the tripartite, linkages between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. I think there's no doubt that Somaliland has been a successful story for a number of years, but now they have held a very successful municipal and parliamentary elections, which were delayed for actually close to 10 years. So the fact that these elections are taking place after a political settlement is quite, I think, impressive. And I'm glad Zito is part of this panel, because he was there as an observer as well. The elections were probably some of the fairest in the continent. The president made a deliberate effort to really push back the state away from the electoral process. So you had an electoral commission that was actually very professional, very competent, and ran the elections quite competently. Then you also had, I think, a state that was determined to use these elections as basically a ticket to international recognition and say, this is what we can achieve. At the same time, I think one also needs to look back at the history of Somaliland. This is a country that emerged out of a brutal campaign of genocide, actually, in which the Barre regime, towards the tail end of its time, basically went and did the same thing Abiy is doing in Tigray. They went and bombed and massacred civilians in Somaliland. There was a brutal uprising, an insurgency, which eventually overthrew the Barre government, and then Somaliland declared its independence. Well, we are 30 years down the line, we are actually seeing the emergence of a very strong democratic state, not yet recognized, but still with its own flag, its own currency, its own army, which is actually stronger than many of the armies in the federal states across Somalia. So, you are talking of a country that has all the rights to be called a state. Unfortunately, because of the way in which we have fetishized the African Union's idea about the inviolability of colonial borders, no country is willing to actually be the first to recognize Somaliland. But there is a growing trend. I think Zito may want to come in on this, but there is a very strong momentum towards recognizing Somaliland. Back to you.
Zito, I'm happy to hear what you think. Rashid is saying that this is a country with all the paraphernalia of a state, and yet the international community is quite reluctant to give it the recognition that it deserves. Your thoughts?
I was in Hargeisa and Berbera during the elections. I stayed there for like, I think, 8 days. And myself, I have participated in elections as a candidate in my country. I have observed a number of elections in Africa, in different countries, Malawi, DRC, Congo, Uganda, Kenya. And what I saw in Somaliland, I have never seen. I have never seen it inside Tanzania, in my own country. The way the election was transparent, the way the maturity showed shown by the political actors in the election, the way the civil society was heavily involved in monitoring the election, and the way the people were excited about the election. Hundreds of thousands of people were on the line very early in the morning. Women, young people, and Somaliland voting age is 15. So we have a lot of young people who went to vote, and the transparency in the counting of votes. I observed I had to sit in one polling station. I wanted to see how. Was this just a facade that to show us as observers that there is a free and fair? So I decided to sit in one of the polling stations in rural parts of the Hargeisa, and I saw there were no army, nothing, and the election, the votes, the way they are being counted in a very transparent manner. All the agents of political parties were there. It was really good. So now I just wanted to give that recap. I come to the recognition. I think the time is now for Africa to recognize Somaliland as an independent republic. It is not yesterday, it is not tomorrow, it is now. And what we need is just a single African country, one, to recognize, and all others will follow. In private discussions with a number of African leaders, it's like everyone is waiting to see who will be the first. So actually, me and my colleagues from Zimbabwe and Uganda, Colonel Besige, Karim would know, and from Zambia, we decided to give ourselves a job, a task, to get that country that will be the first. And we are getting it. And I think very soon, the world will hear the first African nation to recognize Somaliland. And it's not just a small country, it's a big African country with a history of independence and independence struggle, that nobody will stand up and say that country supports secessionists in Africa. It's a country with all the credibility to say, I, as a president of so-and-so country, recognize Somaliland. And I think the moment that happens, all other countries will follow, and we will see the international community follow. The international community is ready, but they are waiting for Africa to start. And all African heads of states are like, let's wait for the African Union. No, one nation, the moment it recognizes Somaliland, all others will follow. And that thing of inviolability, Rashid, about the borders, colonial border, African Union itself had started the way. Eritrea is independent. South Sudan is independent. And these were not independent countries when the African Union, the OU, then was in the process of forming. But Somaliland was an independent country with all the recognitions, with the seat at the UN, with the international telephone number, the code number. It was an independent country. So even the argument, even if South Sudan did not exist and Eritrea did not exist, even the argument of the colonial borders did not hold water as far as Somaliland is concerned. And I'm sure we have to continue this work. The Somalilanders have been fighting for it for 30 years. We have to give a boost, refuel the struggle, and move on and make Somaliland independent state.
Yeah, thank you
for the end
for
of
that. Recognition, even from a legal kind of technical point of view, it is, primarily a political act. It has nothing to do with considerations around the colonial borders, because if the Somaliland people want to have a different future, exercising their right to self-determination, which is at the core of the decolonial movement in the 1970s and still today. And in fact, the right to self-determination normatively had become stronger than it was in the 1960s and the 1970s. And I see no conflict whatsoever with the kind of foundational principles of the African Union itself. It's a society that works, probably the only society that works in East Africa. And I think that factor in itself should be sufficient for countries to want to recognize them. Karim, I want to come to you. Uganda is one of those countries where there is significant traffic of international actors, Western NGOs, Western stakeholders, maybe not the same as Ethiopia, but it's one of those countries where there are significant presence of the West. To what extent is the West contributing to sustaining or consolidating Museveni today?
I think there's a big role. The international partners and international bodies that have played in the continuity of authoritarian regimes on the continent. And I'm going to cite a few examples. I mean, some of us who are here, some people think we are just comfortable and shouting and making noise or selling out our countries to the West. Why do we want these people to come in and intervene? But two things. While we are pushing these international partners, international bodies to hold regimes accountable, they will not. That the rate at which our international partners are holding these regimes accountable is zero, almost zero. I'm going to give an example. For the most part of last year, when the pandemic had just hit, we received a reasonable amount of money from the IMF at the tune of $491 million. We received 300 US million dollars from the World Bank, 15 from the State Department, 10 from USA, and also EU chipped in to help the situation in Uganda. Although the situation at the time, wasn't as it is right now. We had time to set up our institutions, to equip our health sectors. However, most of those funds were channeled into the election. And we stood up here to ask our international partners to hold the regime accountable, to ask them to be accountable before they give them more funds. And just yesterday, we were on the streets in DC pushing the IMF before they disbursed 900 million US dollars to Uganda to hold them accountable. Because what happens is it creates it promotes some kind of acquiescence to authoritarianism. Each time you give these authoritarian regimes money that you will never follow up. And another thing we cannot forget to talk about is the role of international PR and international lobby firms that these regimes are hiring. For example, in Washington, D.C. here, Museveni has about 2 lobby firms that he pays to a tune of $1 million a year to do PR for him. So while we are here shouting on the street, he's paying a check to somebody to say, what, no, let this happen. We have been having that as a problem, and it's not only in Uganda. There are lobby firms that are scrambling and petitioning African dictators. They are, they are in DC on K Street and C Street trying to find the next dictator to pimp in Washington, D.C., and also in London. So we cannot underestimate the power or the influence. We know how much invested they have with the dictators, and the role of us as Africans seeking solutions for Africa, especially in the diaspora, is to be given a seat on the table. There are so many American, for example, here in America, so many American think tanks that will take root to diagnose the situation in Uganda or in Ethiopia, and they will not even consult, people like Abdi who are on ground to give them a clear synopsis of what's going on. So they have their own bodies. They would rather fund think tanks from here than hiring or than asking consultants, national consultants, people like, doctor right there, you would be a good person to make a case for Ethiopia behind these marble walls. However, they rather get an intern who went in Ethiopia and was there for a few months and now is an expert here in DC. So that's what's happening. So there is still a big role that these countries are playing, and we are not begging. We are not begging them to come and rescue us, but we are asking them. We are asking them not only to be accountable to their people, but to be accountable to the world as a whole. Most of us are being seen as sell out. Oh, you're selling us. Oh, you're asking the West to come. No, we are not. We are only asking them to get their foot off of our neck.
Absolutely, absolutely. Maza, I want to come to you. The response of the international community with regard to the Tigray war and the humanitarian crisis unfolding there, compared to the West's response in the region, there seems to be a significant level of interest and engagement on the part of the West. Both the European Union and the United States have been active. Do you assess their responses to be sufficient so far?
Not at all. It's not sufficient at all. And I think it's because there is this very mistaken belief that Abiy is a reformist. I think the West is still convinced that Abiy is this leader that would help them bring about the type of Ethiopia that they envision as, international actors. Despite, the mountain and the very concrete evidence of gross violation of international laws, war crimes and crimes against humanity, a lot of the significant international actors seem to believe that Abiy still has a hope. So I don't think they are ready to let him go. They're rather trying to find, scapegoating. They're trying to find, a full person, a full guy for him. And that seems to be the Eritrean president and the Eritrean state by itself. So the international community, they kept on expressing concerns and telling us that they're very, oh, sorry about that.
Mazdari, okay?
I'm okay. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you travel and you're in a hotel room. People come and I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, thank you. But I was saying the international community, despite the fact that they're very much concerned about the humanitarian crisis that is being displayed mainly because of the political crisis and the genocidal war, I don't think that they're taking enough action. They know what the problems are. They know what needs to be done. But I feel like they're not ready to let go of Abiy Ahmed and his party because they still remain confident that he is a reformist. But the fact on the ground is far from that. Abiy Ahmed is not a reformist. He's not a person or a leader, or even the political ideology he has is not the type of ideology that would actually bring Ethiopians together towards a better future, democratization, what have you. So there still needs to be much work that is needed to be done in terms of letting the international community know that if they wish to see a stable and a strong and secure Ethiopia, then Abiy Ahmed is not the leader to deliver that. Because you cannot really force people into assimilation. Ethiopia can only be stable if the rights of nation and nationalities are respected. And when you have leaders that are willing to do whatever it takes in order to consolidate their power forcefully and impose a type of governance on nation and nationalities, then you have to be certain and ensure that stability is the last thing you'd see. And in addition to that, I feel like there is still most of the support coming from the international community to the Ethiopian state is not necessarily because of Abiy Ahmed, it's rather because of the democratic values that the West wants to see in Ethiopia being respected. So it's also, I sometimes I also think that the international community is worried, okay, then if we get rid of Abiy for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that he has either facilitated or led others to commit, then what's going to happen after that? I don't think the international community is ready to answer that question. And at the same time, there is also lack of political will, to do the right thing. And that's why you see a lot of countries and leaders talk only about the humanitarian crisis and not necessarily about what caused it. Obviously, starvation and rape are at the hallmark of Abiy's genocidal war on Tigray. Abiy, just like the other, previous regimes in Ethiopia, very well understands the power in food, the power in starving people. So what is being done onto the people of Tigray right now is exactly the same that has happened during the Derg regime, during Emperor Haile Selassie's era, and during Menelik as well. So they're trying to starve the people of Tigray into subjugation, but this is because they know the power in food, and the international community knows all of this. But leaders from the US, from the EU are not willing to discuss the political root causes of this famine. They're not willing to talk about what exactly women and young girls in Tigray are being gang raped, not only by Ethiopian troops, but also by Amhara militia and Eritrean troops. So I say all of this to say that the international community hasn't been doing enough job in terms of protecting civilians and bringing war crimes and individuals that facilitate this kind of atrocities to justice. And that's mainly because there is lack of political will from their side. And at the same time, there is this fear of, disintegrating Ethiopia and not, being, not to play a role in that process. But I don't think they know that it's actually their inaction that is actually going to facilitate that disintegration.
Right. Thank you, Mother, for that. Rashid, it is 8:30. You did say you have to leave by 8:30, but I want to ask you one question before you leave. Now, we have been talking about a range of problems. We started at the continental level. We talked about the African Union. We talked about lack of inter-societal solidarity. We talked about the West. But I guess the key target of this conversation really is this idea of solidarity and how we can go about building solidarity at the grassroots level between people across border. What can be done to strengthen that link, to provide that sense that whenever something happens in one African country, that is understood as a problem that happens to other Africans as well?
That is an excellent question, Dr. Awal, and I think there is no doubt that solidarity is a very powerful tool for not just, I think, uniting the African people, but also bringing our collective weight to bear on crisis, to improve early warning systems and mechanisms, to intervene early. All these mechanisms cannot come into place unless there is solidarity. You will find today people are more informed about what is happening, let's say in the United States, than what is happening in Tigray. There isn't that strong sense of, I think, affinity and identity with actually the crisis in Tigray. And this is one of the unfortunate, I think, legacies also of colonialism. Look at our telephone lines, they have to go through Europe, the United States before coming back to Africa. If you want to catch a flight to Morocco, you have to go to Dubai, for example. Africa is so fragmented, yet, we are over 50 years down the line, claiming to be, a liberated, progressive, Africa. Africa is extremely wealthy in terms of resources, but it is deeply fragmented. And I think part of it is an issue of leaders coming together and improving these mechanisms of solidarity. But as both Zito and Karim also mentioned, we shouldn't wait, I think, for states and for organizations to actually kickstart that process of solidarity. This forum, which Awol and Niaza and you other guys have come through, is one powerful tool of improving cross, African contacts and solidarity. And I think the fact that Africans are having conversations together on these kind of platforms, using these powerful tools of technology, I think is quite revolutionary. And I think I'm very optimistic about the future, but it needs, progressive, academics like yourself to also be part of these discussions, because I think the danger is that we just don't want to have an empty forum where you have the same views circulating. We want to have forums where ideas are challenged, where fresh ideas are injected into discussions. So there are. I think I am actually very optimistic. We are beginning to see a new, powerful generation of Africans emerging. I think African Union itself, it needs to look at itself, to reflect on its own, I think, flaws, because I think one of the issues which we haven't touched about here is the fact that the African Union is located in Ethiopia, a country that is now in deep, serious crisis. And I think that speaks to the fundamental unraveling of Africa, because if Ethiopia unravels, the whole of African Union also unravels. And I think this should be this sort of epiphany moment where leaders can come together and say, how did we get this wrong? What can we do to basically move Ethiopia away from this trajectory? We haven't seen that kind of leadership emerge, but I'm glad that the conversation is happening, and young people like yourselves are now taking, the reins and of really pushing this conversation forward. Thank you, Awol, and thank you, colleagues. I'm sure we'll be in touch again, but great stuff.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Rashid. Thank you for that excellent contribution, and hopefully we'll see you in some other setting or in some other context. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. And I think Rashid makes some really powerful points there, and I think it's precisely for that reason that this particular series, African Solutions series, properly named, is important. And this is a series that is run, from what I can understand, by young people of Tigrayan origin. I think the more young people in different parts of Africa use the resources that's available at their disposal today, which is technology, social networking side, to engage in these kinds of conversation, I think the more people know about events in different parts of the African continent, not just stuff that happens in Western capitals. I will ask you the same questions, the same question that I asked Rashid, just to give me very quickly what your thoughts are in terms of specific things that needs to be done to build this solidarity that we need. And then we'll go to participants' question. I don't know how long we have left. I'm assuming that probably could go up to maybe we may have another 10, 15 minutes. After this question, we'll go to participants. If you could add your question to the questions and answers after this round, I'll come to you. Karim, what do we need to do to build international, societal solidarity? International in the sense that Uganda is a nation, a country, Kenya is a country. How can we build solidarity across these borders between people and movements at the grassroots level?
Thank you so much, Doctor. I think one of, like Abdi said, this is a good starting point of creating synergies. We have internet as the resource to bring us together as a people. And also, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the African diaspora. I think that's a great starting point. We have a lot of human resource. We have a lot of talent in the diaspora to begin with. We have a good number of young, talented Africans that we need to find ways of connecting and also forming, creating a coalition of the aggrieved. Because that's the time Africa right now is going. So most of us are living in this repressive regime. If we can create a coalition of the aggrieved within the diaspora, find common aspirations of what we would want, short-term goals for Africa, 5 years, what do we want to see, at least for Ethiopia, what do we want to see happen in Somalia, how can we work with the people of Somalia and find African solutions based on maybe the African diaspora, what is their sense? How can we integrate? How can we have a seat on the table of the African diaspora in the African Union? I don't know if they have been able to have a voice within the African Union as the African diaspora, but we would need that. And also on the social on the social base, I mean, enhancing, coming up with creative ways of bringing people together. We used to have the East African community used to be big, but we have to now find things that connect us as a people from the grassroots. We have games that can bring us together. That if something happens and there was a game between Kenya and Ethiopia, the Kenyans would be, would be outraged. But if we don't have things that bring us together, we are going to wait until when we have the Africa Cup to bring us together. And you see the power it has. It's only one event, but it has, it has some power of bringing people together. Although some of the countries don't get to qualify, but we can find other ways. Because if I know I was in a meeting with comrades from Ethiopia and I see something going, it will be easy for me to connect. So we need to have that interconnected. So many people say, if something happens to France, it's going to be easy for someone in Cameroon to say, I stand with France, because he knows a Cameroonian player who is playing in France. So small things like that. We need to find a way of harnessing our social interconnected.
Absolutely. Zito, very quickly, what are the few things that we need to do to build this solidarity that we need?
This is a very important question, Dr. Paul. A very, very important question, because I see it for myself the way since the issue of Tigray started, and I feel how the matter is not known, the issue is not known at all in many parts of Africa. And here in Tanzania, I have been the voice from day one against the atrocities being committed in Tigray. And some people don't understand completely, and some people even make jokes, about why are you dealing with Tigray? And they had a joke like, you are an ambassador of Tigray. But this is because people do not have information. And what Karim said, we have to use the internet. So social media is key. Omni Tigray is doing great job. These days, I don't even have to go and Google to look for what is going on as far as Tigray is concerned. I just go to the pages operated by Omni Tigray and get all the latest information of what's going on. I just go on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and get everything what's going on. So we have to use social media a lot to bring up the information, because the mainstream media not all the time will give the chance. Thirdly, we have to find a way. I don't know how. Dr. Wall, maybe you will help us. We have to find a way of making African young people see that an injustice happening in one African country is an injustice to all. We have to bring that situation. I don't know how, but this is one of the work that has to be done. We need to have, for example, why are we not having public lectures? Okay, COVID-19 could be a problem, but why are we not having public lectures in major African universities about what's going on in Tigray? For example, this is a critical case that we have. Why don't we organize, for example, a talk in Makerere University or Dar es Salaam University, University of Pretoria, so that even people who don't know or they have misconception can come to these lectures and understand. We were doing that during liberation struggle. I know for sure, for example, there were lectures at the University of Dar es Salaam about the struggle in Mozambique, in Angola, even in South Sudan during the civil war. So we also have to get into universities and make this next generation of leaders know the issues going on. And the most important thing is Africans must know that an injustice happening in one African country to a certain African people is an injustice to all Africans. And that will help us to build the solidarity of going forward. Thank you, Dr. Wall.
Exactly, and I think that is precisely the kind of belief that we need to inculcate into young people. But I think the question is, how do we do that? It's not an easy question because it requires changing the way people think transnationally, and that is huge logistical undertaking as well. But yeah, the point is precisely that. Inculcating that belief into people's thinking. Manda, so all the three talked about the ways in which we could potentially go about building solidarity among the various African people who are in the same position, experiencing the same structural powerlessness, the same vulnerability. I want to ask you specifically about Ethiopia, because Ethiopia itself is such a very diverse country with different histories, with different experiences, and there are a significant group of people in Ethiopia today who are facing the same, not the same, but different levels of violence. And I don't see sufficient level of solidarity between these groups. Talk us through some of the challenges. Why are we not seeing significant level of solidarity and collaboration across this group?
I mean, that's head on. That's the main challenge we're having internally in Ethiopia. But before I answer your question, I want to take the opportunity to thank Zito for all that he has been doing. As he rightfully indicated, he has been there for Tigray from the very beginning. He has been, a rare voice of hope through his solidarity. So as a Tigran, I want to say thank you so much for that. It means the world, because it's people that are from the place that we called and consider to be home for so many centuries that are killing, raping, and murdering us, and yet you have a brother from a different country that is standing in solidarity to support and to amplify the plight of the innocent people of Tigray. So I want to say thank you, and I'm sure his work is exemplary. I'm sure he's leading by example. I think seeing leaders like him talk about injustice in a very far land and making sure that this injustice understood not only from a point of pity for the people of Tigray, but from a self-actualized interest is very critical. And I think he has been doing that through his advocacy. So I want to say thank you. Having said that, the main challenge as to why different people from different nation and nationalities in Ethiopia are not standing with Tigray, not coming together to tackle the root cause of the genocidal war and the brutality they're facing within their own communities. Because, in my opinion, because state is still the center of the analysis. People are not the center of the political analysis that's being done in Ethiopia right now. Whenever you ask a fellow, brother or sister from the Oromia community, for example, as a Tigran, whenever I share my story, whenever I tell them the brutality that my family is going through, they feel the pain and they stand with me. But on a larger scale, when you talk about what's happening and the need to come together, still people are putting the state, the governments at the center of their analysis, and not necessarily the democratic principles that are being infringed upon, not necessarily the civilians that are being targeted. And at the same time, there has also been an active state propaganda targeting Tigrans and their government. Tigrans and their government have been successfully made the other, they have been made the enemy, responsible for every bad thing the country went through and is going through. So when there is such an active state propaganda, then people are brainwashed. So because of that, they find it very difficult to come together, although they have principles that fundamentally they share. Also, they have a common enemy that needs to be, ousted from office and replaced by, a governing body or ideology that works for everybody. So at the heart of all of this is hate. At the heart of all is misinformation and active disinformation that has been employed by the prime minister and his cronies from the very day he came to office. So it's going to take us a lot of, calmness. It's going to take a lot of consideration to see, the power of disinformation and misinformation, and at the same time, state propaganda. So unless majority of Ethiopians, apart from the Tigray, are able to see this through, then it may be very difficult for them to stand with the people of Tigray. And by not standing with the people of Tigray, they're not only failing the people of Tigray, they're also failing the democratic values and principles that the people of Tigray are fighting for. And these are values and principles that would also be very imperative in upholding the interests of other communities as well. So I think it's about time that everybody in Ethiopia sees Abiy Ahmed and recognize that these are nothing but things that would bring about everyone's misery. Abiy is literally flourishing at the misery of the Tigray people today. He did it to the Oromo community. He, excluded Walega, for example, for 6 months and bombed and killed a lot of people there. And no one really stood with them and spoke against this. So we were silent when the Oromos were being brutalized by the Prosperity Party. Now it seems like it's Tagaru's turn, except that, the scale is much higher in Tigray. So tomorrow and the day after, it's going to scale up and flirt to other parts of the country. So I think we all need to come together and take care of this problem. But as Ethiopians come together, in the meantime, the international community, particularly Africans, we have to take the notion of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is it's not a term, it's not an ideology that should be used by dictatorial regimes to rob each other's back, but Pan-Africanism should focus on African citizens. It should be about protecting African citizens and not necessarily the state. So the minute we take ownership and reclaim the notion of Pan-Africanism and we say no to dictatorial regimes despite where they are, that's when our power will resonate more as Africans, whether in the diaspora or on the ground, and we'll be able to tackle issues such as the Tigray genocide and every other problem other Africans are facing in their own homeland.
Mm, absolutely, and I think the fact that there has not been a genuine dialogue and honest conversation among communities that are committed to similar worldviews within the same country, right? I think that says a lot about how weak the bond of solidarity is. Ethiopians need to have some honest, some serious conversations, some uncomfortable conversations. And I think unless we come to a point where we are willing to be confronted, to be challenged by some inconvenient facts, it would be very difficult for this country to move forward. And solidarity is absolutely essential. If people who are subjected to the same dictatorial regime could not sympathize with one another, right, could not amplify each other's voices, how do you expect people far away in the region to actually pay attention and sympathize with you. So that work needs to begin at home. I want to move to audience question. Not that many. It's not a particularly engaging audience, I must say, because it seems that most people here on this panel probably don't have a radically different views, and that's why. One question here, probably for Maza, I think, is the disintegration of Ethiopia inevitable, and is embracing and preparing for it the best long-term solution for the nation's nationalities of Ethiopia as well as the rest of the world? Yeah, this question of disintegration has been, it is being presented as something that is becoming inevitable. And it's a very complex country. I just want to solve that to you, Mada. I'll let Karim and Dito comment if they want to comment. But is it inevitable? Should we prepare for that?
And answering this question, I want to focus on why the country might, disintegrate, and what our perspective, my perspective, is as a Tigran. As a Tigran, I know the right to self-determination is something we hold dear to our heart. This is something that was not given to us. It's something that our forefathers paid with their blood and flesh. During the Derg era, over 60,000 civilians have sacrificed their life to protect the Tigrans' right to self-determination. And later on, the other nationalists joined the armed struggle and fought and sacrificed a lot to also have their right to self-determination respected. So I think one of the main things that holds different nations and nationalities together in Ethiopia is this fundamental right. So as long as this people's right is not respected, Ethiopia would always be in chaos. Ethiopia would always be in turmoil, in conflict, and in violence and war. So anyone that is, concerned or worried about the stability of Ethiopia should really look into how we can best preserve people's right to self-determination. And as a Tigran, I can only speak that it's very hard for me to really continue referring to myself as Ethiopian in the face of the brutal violation that my people have been faced with in the past 8 months. If my leaders are tortured and killed, if my mothers are raped, if my sisters are raped, if priests are forced to rape their children, if all the developmental gains that the people of Tigray have worked so hard in the past 30 plus years are destroyed, not only by Ethiopians, but also by foreign enemy that was led into Tigray to do this war crime and crimes against humanity, I cannot imagine myself as an Ethiopian. So the question of disintegration, it's something we have to see how it, unfolds in the future. But as it stands, it's very important for everyone to understand that Tigrans will continue to fight for their freedom. Tigrans will continue to fight for their right to self-determination, no matter how hard it is. As you can see right now, there are multiple actors in Tigray, hovering across, the village and cities. Logically, the bravery and the resistance that is coming from Tigray defies logic. It's against all odds that Tigrans continue to fight and win, very significant victories here and there. And also to show the dedication and the amount or the extent to which Tigrans would go to have their right to self-determination respected is also manifested in the fact that the young Tigrans that were in the diaspora are joining the armed struggle. They're going back to Tigray so that they can join the armed struggle and participate in the process of freeing their land. For example, a very dear friend of mine called Desta, he was a senior journalist at the BBC and was based in Kenya. He dropped everything behind and went back to Tigray. Now he's actively participating in the armed struggle. A lot of other young Tigrans have went back to Tigray from the US and from Australia. So this goes to show you the extent to which we are ready to go to have our right self-determination respected. And if the Ethiopian regime and the international community is not able to see this, the war would prolong, and at some point, Ethiopia will disintegrate. So, is it going? In my opinion, it's inevitable, but it can be stopped by respecting people's choices, people's political decisions, and at the same time, people's right to self-determination.
Right. So any attempt at finding a solution or a cure to Ethiopia's problem must start from this notion of the right to self-determination of people. This has to be kind of the political legal space that we have to inhabit. Thank you for that, Maaza. Karim, there is a question for you. The question is, why hasn't Museveni been sanctioned for human rights abuses?
Thank you so much. I think we have been dealing with the issue of sanctions for a while, and what we're hearing from the international community most of the time is sanctioning a country as a whole puts those who are vulnerable in a terrible state. However, I think there has been efforts to issue individual sanctions. For example, here in the United States, they have specially designated nationals and blocked persons. Ugandans have been pushing for that to at least invoke global Magnitsky sanctions to those who have been at the forefront of abusing human rights, especially those in the security forces. And one of the people, one of the generals that has been cited is Museveni's son himself, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is the current commander of the ground forces. So there have been attempts. However, the challenge has been how do the sanctions be implemented without hurting the vulnerable. And I think as of now, there has been a discussion within the EU to invoke sanctions for specific persons. Also, the UK and the United States have signed onto an agreement to not only do human rights, to sanction those who have been abusing human rights, but also corrupt officials. They are going to be seizing their properties within here in the United States and the European Union. So that the conversation for these sanctions is still going on. And we know previously the United States earlier this year issued visa sanctions to government officials. We know that doesn't really affect all of them. However, it is a starting point, and we know sooner or later we shall have a list of special and designated nationals and blocked persons out for global Magnitsky sanctions.
Karim, Zito, Maaza, thank you so much for what was a productive conversation, and I hope we'll get to meet on another similar platform to pursue these same conversations. But for now, we have been here for nearly 2 hours. I think exactly 2 hours.
I want to leave you with a line that I just want to quote. These are not my words. These are words of the former president of Tanzania in response to what Maaza said. I'm just quoting. When people have reason to be afraid, you cannot reassure them through the barrel of a gun. Your only hope is to talk as one man to another or as one group to another. It is no use the federal authorities demanding that the persecuted should come as a supplicant for mercy by first renouncing their secession from the political unit. For the secession was declared because the Igbo people felt it to be their only defense against extermination. This is the line.
Very powerful stuff. Thank you, Zito, for that. I think it's a very good note on which to end. Once again, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see each other on a different platform to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Salama.